Hope everyone had a nice break. In a moment, we're going to hear from Lynn Engel. But what I wanted to do was, if I could, single out the members of the steering committee and have them stand, and with our thanks. Judge Michael Andrews, Senator Jeff Brandes, Deborah Brodsky, Nancy Daniels, Judge David Denkin. Oh, wow. R.J. Larissa, Martin McDonnell, Judge John Morgan, Chelsea Murphy, Dan Nordby, Sal Nuzzo, Brian Tannenbaum, and Sandy Weinberg. Thank you all so very much. Again, this would not have happened but for your participation. So Lynn Engel has come here from Massachusetts, and also his background is in your brochure from the Crime and Justice Institute. It's an area that he's concentrated on for over 25 years. And he's involved in numerous states around the country. His focus has been on the development of a justice reinvestment approach to help states develop data and evidence-based strategies to improve public safety, reduce incarcerations, and attack recidivism. Please welcome Lynn Engel, the Director of Policy and Campaigns for the Crime and Justice Institute in Boston.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming. I want to especially thank the bar for the invitation and for President Suskauer and the steering committee for elevating this important issue at least across the state for the bar. Again, my name is Lynn Engel. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns for the Crime and Justice Institute, and I've been working on state-level policy for the past 10 years across the country. In the past 2 years, I've been focused to some degree on Florida's policy, doing policy and data analysis in an effort to assist the legislature in navigating the sometimes rough terrain of criminal justice policy development. Crime and Justice Institute is a nonprofit focused on data-driven, research-supported solutions to criminal justice problems. We've collaborated with a number of organizations and agencies across the country and worked in several states, cities, and counties. So I've been asked sort of to set the stage for some of the discussions that will occur later today and tomorrow, and to hopefully help influence the discussions that will occur in the legislature in the coming session and then beyond. Here's what we'll hopefully cover today. We'll look at Florida's prison population and crime trends, recent population trends. We'll dig a little deeper in Florida's prison population, and then we'll close it with a focus on research and policies, some comparisons with other states. The analysis that follows was conducted by CJI's data analysts last year for a project supported by OPAGA. We examined 10 years of data from 2007 to 2016, which is our typical analysis period for this kind of an examination. We used Florida DOC data, and I should say at the outset, I want to say that the Florida DOC leadership and their research staff was fantastic to work with. It has some of the best data collection and analytic capacity I've seen. And the data collected by the DOC provides the backbone for that is necessary to understand and to understand the drivers of the prison population and the opportunity for change. So this is probably a familiar graphic for most people in this room. It is a story that virtually every state in the country has for its state prison population. For Florida, the prison population experienced rapid growth from the early 1980s to 2010, when the population topped 100,000 people. Since then, the population has slowly declined. Today, FDC incarcerates just under 97,000 people. However, despite this recent drop, the FDC projects that the population will begin to rise beginning in 2021 or so, and may continue for the foreseeable future. Florida should expect that its population will hover between 95,000 and 100,000 individuals for the foreseeable future. So with growth to that degree, you also have cost. The DOC operating budget has increased $1 billion over the past 20 years. Nationally, 1 out of 15 state general fund dollars went to corrections in 2015. In Florida, that figure is 1 out of 11 state dollars. And the current FDC budget exceeds $2.4 billion. So Florida's imprisonment rate, the number of people in prison per 100,000 population, has followed a similar pattern over the years and is 23% above the national average. Florida's imprisonment rate is higher than most large population states and is 10th highest in the country. The next few slides, we're going to look at crime rate trends and a comparison with New York. New York and Florida have similar overall populations, around 20 million people, and presents a reasonable comparison. Like the rest of the country, Florida's crime rate, which is UCR rates, the Uniform Crime Reports as reported by the FBI, has plunged from its peak in the late 1980s. In the last 10 years, this trend has continued in Florida, and since 2006, the property crime rate fell 29%. New York's follows a similar trajectory. Violent crime in Florida, as it has across the country, has also declined significantly. Since 2006, Florida's violent crime rate has dropped 36%. This drop is more than twice that of New York, which saw a decrease in violent crime of 13% over the same period. So, looking at the effect of this crime decline on prison population over the course of this period, the 3 lines show Florida in yellow, the national incarceration rate in light blue, and New York's imprisonment rate in dark blue. New York has seen a significant and steady drop since 2000, while Florida did not stop growing until 2010. Since then, it has experienced a small reduction, as I indicated earlier. However, that's expected to increase. So despite having similar incarceration rates in the early 1990s, Florida and New York have parted ways since then. New York currently has less than 51,000 people in its prison system. So these data only begin to tell the story. This is sort of a national picture, and the data is largely the result of a publicly available analysis. We'll take a closer look now, some of the recent trends in Florida's prison population. So this is called the iron law of prison populations. 2 things that affect the size of the population: the number of people coming in the door and the amount of time they spend in prison. When you look at increasing or decreasing populations, you look at admissions and you look at length of stay. Looking first at admissions, we find Florida prison admissions are made up of 3 distinct groups: people sentenced directly to prison, called new court commitments; people out on probation or community control supervision and later revoked; and people released to post-prison release supervision and later returned to prison on a technical violation. The data show that admissions to prison have declined significantly. Of the total decline, about 60% was caused by a decline in probation revocations, which fell 39% in this period. The question is why that steady decline, a fairly significant decline compared to other states. The reason is primarily focused in a handful of areas. Increased use of alternatives to incarceration, especially for supervision violations, the reduction in crime, which has led to a reduction in felony filings, and fewer probation revocations returned to prison. This is what the graph looks like. It's pretty impressive. If I saw this graph in a state that had requested assistance, I'd ask what the problem is. They seem to be going in the right direction and obviously are doing some things right. But there's always a but. Prison stays are longer. People sent to prison are staying longer. Well, there are few people coming in the door. Those that are sent to prison have longer sentences, and they're serving a longer portion of those sentences. And the result is a fairly stagnant prison population over the past 10 years. Based on the dramatic decline in admissions, we would have expected to see a far more significant reduction in the overall prison population. So to sum up some of these data points, since 1990, Florida's crime rate has declined 65%. In the last 10 years, prison admissions have dropped 28%, driven by a 39% decline in probation revocations. The length of stay has grown 18%, and sentence length has grown 22%. And as a result, largely have a prison population that is unchanged despite that significant crime decline. So looking deeper into the data, there are some clear positives. There are some things Florida is doing right. Fewer people coming in the door, largely driven by fewer nonviolent offenses, especially drug crimes, as well as a decline in supervision revocations. However, the people admitted to prison receive longer sentences and are staying longer than those on those sentences than they were 10 years ago. In the next set of slides, we'll look a little deeper into the prison population and the policies that may be influencing these outcomes. We talked about the role of admissions to prison in the overall population. Here is a trend analysis of admissions between 2007 and 2016. These are the top 10 crimes at admission, number of people coming in the door. These are the top 10 crimes for 2016. And then there's a comparison with the admissions from 2007. Clearly some progress. In 2007, 4,400 people were admitted for drug possession alone. In 2016, that number is less than 2,000. However, despite this progress, 2 of the top 3 crimes at admission are drug crimes, and 8 of the top 10 crimes are nonviolent offenses. We're now looking at the standing population. That's a snapshot of the prison population on a given day, as opposed to the admission cohort or the release cohort. We have a prison population broken out by offense type: violent crime, property crime, drug crime, and other. Notably, the number of people serving drug sentences is down fairly significantly, as I indicated, largely because of the drop in admissions, but the number of violent crime and property sentences is up. Other sentences remain static. These offenses include driving under suspended license, firearm possession by a felon, felony DUI, and fleeing or eluding police. The bulk of this category is DUI and gun possession offenses. There's something to remember when we look at a graph like this. Florida was in the midst of an unprecedented crime decline in 2007 that continued well through 2016. Yet the state continued to lock up greater numbers of offenders in some of these categories. So with trends indicating longer sentences and longer lengths of stay, we looked at characteristics like criminal history to understand what might be causing these trends. Are some of these nonviolent people coming in who have violent criminal pasts? In a snapshot of the standing population, we find that nearly 30% of those in prison do not have a current or prior violent offense. Other characteristics we look at include factors that affect the sentence length and the release policies. The impact of mandatory minimum sentences and sentence enhancements has been a hot topic in policy discussions across the country, and Florida is no stranger to this discussion. Sentences with a mandatory minimum or an enhancement increased 37% during this 10-year period, an increase of more than 5,000 people serving a mandatory minimum or an enhanced sentence. In 2016, Florida's Committee on Criminal Justice conducted an inventory of mandatory minimum terms and identified 108 offenses that carry a mandatory minimum sentence, and 47 of them applying to drug offenses. So back to those four categories, the four offense types, again, violent, property, drug, and other crimes, to understand lengths of stay for each of those categories. We see increases in time served across all offense types. So while admissions to this population declined, as I indicated, lengths of stay increased, and they increased in all of these categories. These increases may not look significant. Property crime increased by about 2 months. Drug crime increased by about 6 months. However, spread across the population serving those sentences for those offenses, it adds up. For instance, there are more than 20,000 people serving a property crime. 2 months longer on their length of stay makes a big difference. There are nearly 14,000 people serving drug sentences. A 6-month increase in each of those sentences has a measurable impact on the overall prison population. One of the striking demographic stories in Florida, in Florida's prison system, is the growth of people aged 50 and older, defined in statute as the elderly population. We have a legislator that wants to own up to that. This is Florida, 50. Anyway, in 2016, this group made up 23% of the prison population, nearly a quarter, an increase from 14% in 2007. A 65% growth in the elderly population. In raw numbers, this is over 23,500 people 50 years or older incarcerated in the state prison. The spiraling cost of corrections health care is a direct result of this growth. We often see when analyzing the elderly population is that they are serving sentences for very serious crimes, violent repeat offenders in for an awful long time. And while much of Florida elderly population is in for a violent crime, a sizable number is serving a sentence for a nonviolent crime. And as we'll see, this is likely the result of both longer sentences due to mandatory minimums and enhancements, and the limited release options due to the 85% law. So to recap, some key findings. Low-level nonviolent admissions have declined over the past 10 years, but 8 of the top crimes at admission are nonviolent, and 2 of the top 3 are drug crimes. Time served has increased across all offense types. 37% of the prison population received a mandatory or an enhanced sentence. And the number of prisoners age 50 and older grew 65% in the last decade. Finally, we'll take a look at research into incarceration and recidivism, more closely examine the policies that underpin the data findings, and we'll look at how other states reacted to similar findings. This is not news to anybody. First, the research. As we age, we slow down. And this applies to people engaged in criminal activity. The older you get, the less likely you are to engage in criminal behavior. And recidivism show that age is one of the clearest determinants of a person's likelihood of returning to crime. Over the past 20 years, researchers have examined many facets of the criminal justice system with an emphasis on understanding the causes of crime, the impact of incarceration and non-incarceration sanctions, and on recidivism. The studies revealed that the limited utility of incarceration, other than to remove a person from society for a certain period of time. For public safety purposes, incarceration does not generally reduce recidivism more than non-custodial sanctions, such as probation and treatment. And for lower level offenders, such as drug offenders and probation violators, you may actually increase their likelihood of committing a crime and committing crime more regularly. This is called the criminogenic effect. Researchers also looked at whether longer periods of time in prison reduce recidivism more than shorter periods. They matched offenders with similar criminal backgrounds that were incarcerated for short periods of time to those who were incarcerated for longer periods of time and compared recidivism rates. These studies found that incarcerating someone for a longer period doesn't result in lower recidivism rates, and therefore a longer period in prison does not improve public safety more than shorter periods. We'll now look at the policies in Florida that impact the length of sentences and the amount of time served on the sentence, and we'll focus on the portion of the prison population serving time for nonviolent offenses. This is a group that policymakers typically look at when considering changes to sentencing and release policies. This is also a population where community-based supervision and treatment can be a reasonable alternative. Listed here are a couple of the compelling data points that typically attract the attention of policymakers who may be looking to get a better return on their criminal justice investment or simply want to reduce the size of the prison population. Currently, or actually as of 2016, felony petty theft admissions had increased 36%, and there were more than 600 people serving a felony petty theft sentence. This is the third conviction for a theft offense for less than $300. Drug offenses, 1,900 possession sentences admitted to prison in 2016, serving sentences of nearly 2 years. And admissions for drug offense with a mandatory minimum rose 34% in 10 years. So we'll look at the factors in Florida's sentencing policy that appear to be having the greatest effect on increasing sentence lengths and on the growth of time served. These are mandatory minimum sentences, sentence enhancements, which include drug-free zone and habitual offender enhancements, and finally the 85% law. As I mentioned earlier, Florida has 108 mandatory minimum sentences, 47 for drug offenses. On top of that, Florida has a habitual offender enhancement, which applies to repeat offenders and obviously some very serious criminality. These not only increase the sentences, but also compound the effect with mandatory minimums in addition to the habitual enhancement. When commercial drug offenses, selling, distribution, and manufacturing occur in certain protected area, the sentence is automatically increased, and in some cases includes a mandatory minimum sentence. Drug-free zones came out of the need to protect vulnerable populations and the locations where they congregate, such as children in schools or at parks. Policymakers then drew a perimeter around these locations, ranging from 500 to 1,000 and sometimes as high as 2,000 feet from that distance, to develop a zone in which selling drugs would expose a person to a longer sentence, and in some cases, to a mandatory minimum sentence. However, these locations began to expand as a way of broadening the effect of increased sentences. The result is cities and towns that are nearly all within a zone and with very different treatment for the same conduct occurring only a short distance apart. What stands out in Florida's policy is the extensive list of protected areas, including convenience stores, and the severe sentence that can result. And lastly, the 85% law. Again, a product of the 1990s and the truth in sentencing movement. However, in Florida, the 85% requirement applies to all felony sentences. This is not the case in just about any other state. Another key factor to the length of stay is the abolition of parole in 1983. Right now, there are very few release mechanisms, and the primary release mechanism in the department at this point is the expiration of the sentence. One last thing I need to mention, because it has a significant impact on the sentence imposed, and I believe has as big an impact on the sentence lengths and on sentence lengths as mandatory minimums and on enhancement sentences. This is the Criminal Punishment Code. It's the most complicated thing I've ever tried to understand in my career, and that's why I don't put any slides up. I don't want to be held accountable. So if there's an expert in the room, I would love a tutorial. As I understand it, the code adds points for a felony offense and for multiple offender characteristics. These then provide a range of sentence options. However, incarceration is always a possibility. That includes jail. And the sentence range always includes the maximum authorized by law. In order to comprehensively reform Florida sentencing policy, the code should be something policymakers look seriously at. So I'll close with a look at some states that have experienced similar impacts. Policy comparisons with other states. These states have examined the data and the research and reconsidered their policy efforts, their policies in an effort to reduce the unnecessary use of incarceration, use criminal justice resources more effectively, and get better public safety outcomes by shifting resources to alternatives to incarceration that have been proven effective at reducing recidivism. This slide shows 3 states that have defelonized their possession offenses, at least the first few convictions. Notable here is Oklahoma. Through a ballot measure in 2016, it defelonized all possession offenses. This measure passed with 60% of the vote. Many states have studied the disproportionate impact of drug-free zones in densely populated urban areas and made changes to reduce the zones to curb the use of the enhancement. Utah, for instance, reduced the zone from 1,000 to 100 feet and eliminated several locations from the list of protected areas, primarily because they did not sufficiently target children or the elderly. South Carolina, interestingly, shifted the burden, requiring the state to prove the defendant intended to sell drugs within the drug-free zone. Since 2001, at least 30 states have raised their felony theft thresholds. Changes in state felony thresholds have not interrupted the long nationwide decline in property crime and larceny rates that began in the 1990s. And a recent study of the effects of South Carolina's 2010 decision to raise felony theft thresholds to $2,000 found that not only have property crime rates continued to fall, these included larceny, motor vehicle theft, and burglary, but the value of stolen goods actually declined. This was a major argument against increasing the threshold, that thieves would begin stealing more expensive items and stay within the misdemeanor offense limit. The analysis conducted after implementation showed that that was not the case. Over the past decade or so, states have begun to roll back the use of mandatory minimum sentence laws. These are just a few of them. New York's Rockefeller laws were infamous and had a significant effect on plea negotiations and sentencing decisions. The repeal of the Rockefeller laws, which took several years, coincided with New York's declining prison population. Another option, not shown up here, but last year considered in the legislature, other than full repeal, is the use of a judicial safety valve, allowing a judge to depart from applying the mandatory minimum sentence or a portion of it. Mississippi authorized the use of a safety valve in 2014. And recently there has been consideration for the use of a reverse valve, requiring the state to show that the mandatory minimum is necessary to protect the public before it can be applied. Most states limit the 85% law to the most serious offenses. Oklahoma, for one, targets murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated drug trafficking in its 85% requirement. As far as I can tell, Florida may be the only state that applies 85% to all felony sentences. The criteria for early release of a medically frail inmate in Florida are fairly restrictive. In 2016, only 17 people were released from the Florida DOC under conditional medical release. Many states have begun to recognize that the elderly population is not only growing in size, but is costing them far more than anticipated to care for, and that this population is far less likely to recidivate than younger offenders. States are now developing policies that allow the transfer of parole or parole of individuals with serious medical needs and a diminished capacity for criminal behavior. Notable on this list is Virginia. Virginia offers a form of release based solely on age and the amount of time served. So, in closing, a couple of the key research findings. Criminal behavior peaks in late adolescence and declines with age. Incarceration is generally not more effective at reducing recidivism than non-custodial sanctions. For some offenders, it can actually increase recidivism. And longer prison stays do not reduce recidivism more than short stays. And from a policy perspective, drug possession and low-level petty theft sentences still make up a measurable portion of the prison population. Mandatory minimum sentences and sentence enhancements have resulted in an increase in both sentence length and the amount of time served on the sentence. And 85% requirements, which apply to all felony sentences, restrict the transfer of elderly or infirm inmates to community-based treatment or supervision. That's all. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Lynn Engel?
Did you study racial disparity in sentencing at all?
We did not. We did not. We had initial data on the racial component. We did not look too deeply into that. There have been some other studies, but that is something we may do in the future. So.
On the elderly population and the spike at 65% growth rate is in the raw number. Do you have the percentage of the inmate population growth rate? So it's kind of an apples to apples comparison. Percentage of incarcerated that
Right.
are over 50 the first year and the percentage over 50
In 10 years later, I think we probably have it, but unlike Gypsy's staff, I am an attorney and not a data analyst. But I can dig that up. Sir.
Is this PowerPoint on your website? And if so, may we plagiarize?
It is not on my website. I finished it a half hour ago, so it will be. And feel free to plagiarize all you want.
And this is being videotaped as well, so you will be able to have access to it.
And the report where this analysis was conducted is on OPAGA's website, and then
What's
OPAGA, somebody, Sal.
Program policy analysis and government accountability.
Thank you.
correctly, there was a big issue about the cost of health care in the prisons. Is the geriatric, do you do any study on the cost of geriatric care specifically?
Only that it's right.
While in prison, because it seems like with these 85% and 100% sentences, that is probably going to be going through the roof in Florida in the next few years.
That's correct. That we project that the elderly population, whether it's 50 or 65, that population is getting older, and there's not a release valve. So they either max out their sentence, expire it, or they go out on some form of medical release, which the criteria is very stiff. As far as I know, your prison health care bill is $500 million, or was last year, or close to it. And I think that's where the decision, the secretary had to make a decision between fully funding her inmate health program, or using some of the funds that had come out of that account to fund some community-based treatment.
Can I ask just one more? Have you done any comparisons regarding the Virginia plan that allows inmates that have been in for over 10 years and reach the age of 60 to have a safety valve for release? Has there been any comparison about how that has saved them money at this point?
I have not. We've not analyzed that. I'm sure there's something out there, but I can look into it.
That seems totally great out.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions, but a quick question. Do we know how many states have a geriatric release program? You had pointed out just a couple.
Yeah. Most states have a geriatric release mechanism. Well, you have one. It's just that you have very stiff criteria. What most states have is parole, so they can then bootstrap changes in parole eligibility based on your medically frail status, your age. So that's what Virginia did. A couple of other states did. They basically said, if you've served a certain portion of your sentence and you've reached this age, your likelihood of returning to crime is low. Therefore, you're less of a public safety threat. We'll put you out on parole and watch you while you're out there. That's obviously not something that Florida has.
We have a few questions.
As it relates to the people in the prison population that are there for drug and property crime offenses, do you have any data as to its defendant's preference to go to prison instead of serving a supervision sentence because the defendant doesn't want to pay for probation or community control, and it's usually a shorter prison sentence than the actual prison term?
Mm-hmm.
Did everyone hear that? Okay. But you wanted to stand up and say it a little bit louder so everyone can hear
I was asking about if there was any data as it relates to the drug and property crime defendants in prison and their desire, the defendant's desire to take a prison sentence instead of taking a supervision sentence because the defendant himself does not want to have the expense of supervision and or usually the longer sentence that supervision comes with and the much shorter prison sentence that they usually receive for those crimes.
Thank you.
I haven't looked into that. That would not be in the DOC data or the state court data system. That might actually be something that Dr. Escobar or her staff might see from the county data to determine whether are defendants taking a plea offer that includes prison or rejecting it, or taking a plea offer that includes probation and rejecting it in an effort to serve less time in prison. We've seen some of that materialize in the discussion of drug courts, where you've reduced a possession offense to a misdemeanor, and the concern that an offender offered a misdemeanor conviction versus going to a drug court would take the misdemeanor offense. That hasn't been borne out by the data, but we're still fairly early in the states that have defelonized. So we'll continue to track that over the next few years.
Thank you. Question.
Lynn, to what extent are Florida's tough on crime policies responsible for historically low crime rates?
Florida, I can't say specifically about Florida, but nationally, multiple reports have indicated that incarceration can be credited with anywhere between 10 and 25% of the crime decline over the past 2 decades. There are multiple reasons why crime declines. The most likely reasons are better policing policies and practices, changes in security, personal security, home security, the waning of the crack epidemic, and changes in economic opportunity. Those are the primary drivers of the crime decline over the past several years, but incarceration clearly has a role. It's just not as significant.
You know, when the New York and the Florida lines, New York declined, Florida agreed, did you check to see if all those New Yorkers had moved to Florida?
But they were
That's question of the day.
they were in the elderly cohort by then.
Okay, sir, and then Judge.
Have you done any study on the increase in life sentences? What used to be just a term of years suddenly becomes a life sentence?
We have not, no. Yes, ma'am?
In terms of petty theft, third, petty theft, being charged with felony, do you have any data from any specific state or region that raised that level, that shows how that population actually decreased?
How the
population decreased? For example, if you have 3 misdemeanor petty theft, the defendant, the individual can be certified as a felony petty theft.
Mhm.
Where does Florida stand? Are we the lowest in terms of the $300, 3, and then you're certified? Or are there other states who've actually done something a little different? I'm just trying to figure out where we are on that spectrum.
You're at the low end. I think there's only 3 other states that have as low property felony threshold as Florida. So other states, other states set it at, most other states are above 1,000 now, 1,000 or 1,500, and I showed you a couple that are even higher than that. So they're basically third strike felony, if they have that provision in their law, would be at the 1,500 mark or the 1,000 mark. In Florida, it's 300, so it kicks it up to a felony based on fairly low value property.
So we're at the low end.
You're at the low end, yes.
Sandy.
Have you compared what's going on in the federal system to Florida or the states?
No, not. The federal system is a beast of its own. It's an incredibly complicated. I mean, if you've looked at the federal drug laws, they're incredibly complicated in their description of roles.
As far as the increase in population or decrease in population in the prisons, have you looked at that?
The federal prison system, my understanding is that it's declined. We're not sure where that decline is, in what population that's declined.
In the statistics that you have with the aging population of prisoners, do you have any information as to how many of those people are sentenced to parole 25?
I don't have that now. I know that the DOC does have that information. They know which of that population. My understanding is we talked about this last year when it came up, specifically around the cost of medical care. That's a population that is, even with parole, they're not getting it because of the seriousness of the offense or the notoriety.
I have another question. In terms of juveniles being certified, do you have any data that would suggest that when a juvenile 14, 15, 16 is actually certified, how much that has increased the prison population?
That I don't know. No, I don't think we looked at that population and their effect on the prison population.
On the judicial relief valve that you described,
Mhm.
how many states are using that? Is it limited to first-time offenders, or what limitations have they put on it?
I don't know how many states have a judicial safety valve. We've looked at several of them. It varies. Largely, it varies. So in Mississippi, for instance, they have a judicial safety valve that was prospective. They made the population of they called it the lower habitual offense. It's basically focused on nonviolent offenders. They made them eligible for the earlier parole. But as it applies to I think in Mississippi, the population, let me just think this through. The safety valve applied prospectively for mandatory minimum sentences for everybody except for habitual violent offenders. They then applied it retroactively to the habitual nonviolent offenders as well. That's my understanding of what Mississippi did. It didn't apply to first or second offenses. Or it didn't limit it to that population.
I have a question in terms of, you talked about nonviolent offenses such as driving while license suspended or revoked. Florida has that HTO, habitual traffic offender. Is there any data that you were able to pull to show of that particular population, how many of those fell within the license area?
We didn't. That was it wasn't in the nonviolent category. It was in the other category. So that's a nonviolent offense, but that was in the other category, and we don't know how many people are in prison for that crime. That population, the other population, is primarily is largely made up of DUI and gun charge offenses. I don't know how many are in for the traffic violations.
Would there be any way to make a distinction in that kind of data?
Oh yeah, the DOC has that capacity, I believe. We may have it. We've still got the data from 2016, so we may be able to look at that. Let's catch up after this. We can.
Any other questions? Hank, would you like to just come up and talk about what's happening in the next few minutes?
Sitting there listening to all this discussion about mandatory life sentences, I had a trial in the Panhandle several years back, a client charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And in the middle of the second week, the judge took a recess and he looked over at me. He said, "This is going really well, isn't it? What do you think?" And I said, "I don't know. I've never done it before." So anyway, you can go see him now. I want to thank Mr. Engel and Dr. Escobar again. This may be our last opportunity as a group to thank you. We're going to break at the 3:30 schedule to the 2 workshops. One is, I said, on the other side of this wall, and that is under sentencing reform on one of the 2 tracks. And I want to thank individually, and if you could just raise your hand, Sal Nuzzo from the James Madison Institute is going to be the moderator of that. Is Rob Bradley here? Rob? Senator Bradley? Hey, Rob. We want to thank you for doing that. Bill Cervone is on that panel. Mr. Engel is, Judge Nellie Kazan, and Stacy Scott from the Public Defender's Office. Is she here? Great. Also at the Duval Room, and remember it's down at 180 degrees around the circle of 4 down, moderated is the pretrial release with Chelsea Murphy. Chelsea's here. I know she's here. She's already downstairs setting up. Judge Kevin Emas, Kara Gross, Sheriff Mark Hunter, and Rachel Logbin. And I want to recognize a couple of people. First of all, I had the privilege, for reasons I won't bore you with, about being the District Court of Appeals conference in West Palm Beach recently. And it was interesting that judges of the District Court of Appeal came up to me and asked if there were a role they could play at this conference. And that includes 2 people who are on the 2 separate panels today, Judge Kevin Emas from the 3rd District Court of Appeal and Judge Nellie Kazan from the 2nd District Court of Appeal. The other thing I want to mention while we're all together here, consistent with the observations that Chief Justice Kennedy made and we said earlier today, and that is putting everybody in the room without forcing agendas on anybody else, but just listening to what the others have to say. And I would ask those who are elected state attorneys to stand and just be recognized. We appreciate it. There are several here. And the elected public defenders who are also here. And finally, as so often happens with an operation at this level or this size, someone will have a conflict where they cannot make it at the last minute. And I want to recognize Tom Palermo. Where's Tom? Tom's here, from the United States Attorney's Office in the Middle District of Florida, who was willing to come at short notice late last night, early this morning, to substitute for somebody on the pretrial release panel who could not make it. And I want to thank you personally for doing that, Tom. So we meet at 3:30 in the breakout rooms. Come back here for the reception. You should have had drink tickets stuck in your little things. If you didn't, I have so many drink tickets in this pocket. Don't you worry about it. So come see me. So good luck. Thank you.